Marcus Thompson believed he was living the American dream with his wife of 8 years, Rachel, and their beautiful 6-year-old son, Ethan, who had Rachel's bright blue eyes and what Marcus thought was his own smile and personality, though relatives and friends frequently commented that Ethan didn't really look much like Marcus at all. Observations that Marcus brushed off because genetics could be unpredictable, and plenty of children didn't resemble their parents strongly, never imagining. Those innocent comments were hints at a devastating truth that would destroy his entire world. Marcus worked as a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm earning $95.00 annually while Rachel was a stay-at-home mother, a decision they'd made together when Ethan was born, because they both believed children benefited tremendously from having a parent home full-time during crucial early developmental years, and Marcus had been genuinely happy to be the sole provider for his family, working extra hours and taking on additional clients to ensure Rachel and Ethan had comfortable lives filled with opportunities, never resenting the financial pressure, because he loved his family and considered providing for them his greatest purpose and achievement. They lived in a modest 3-bedroom home worth $380,000 with a reasonable mortgage, had managed to save $85,000 despite living on a single income, and Marcus had been diligently contributing to a college fund for Ethan that had grown to $45,000, planning and sacrificing to ensure his son would have educational opportunities, without being burdened with student loans the way Marcus had been after his own college experience. Everything changed 6 months ago during what should have been a routine doctor's appointment when Ethan developed a persistent fever and breathing difficulties that landed him in the pediatric urgent care on a Saturday afternoon, scaring both Marcus and Rachel as any parent would be frightened when their child is seriously ill and struggling to breathe properly. The doctor ordered standard blood tests to check for infections and determine the cause of Ethan's symptoms, and during the examination, the physician asked routine questions about family medical history. Did anyone in Marcus's family have respiratory issues, asthma, or immune system disorders that might be relevant to Ethan's treatment and diagnosis? Marcus provided detailed information about his family's medical background, mentioning that his father had adult-onset asthma and his younger sister had struggled with bronchitis as a child, information he thought might help the doctor understand Ethan's condition better and provide more targeted treatment. The doctor nodded, made notes, and then said something that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later prove to be the thread that unraveled Marcus's entire life. Interesting, because Ethan's blood type is O negative, which is quite rare, occurring in less than 1% of the population. What are your wife's blood types? Marcus replied that he was O positive, the most common blood type, and Rachel chimed in that she was also O positive, having donated blood in college and remembering her type clearly from the paperwork. The doctor's expression changed slightly, a flicker of something concerned, confusion, awkwardness crossing his face before he professionally masked it and said, "I see. Well, let's focus on treating Ethan's immediate symptoms." But Marcus noticed the strange reaction and felt a small seed of doubt plant itself in his mind, though he pushed it away because surely there was some explanation, some genetic possibility he didn't understand about blood type inheritance. That night, after Ethan was home and sleeping soundly with antibiotics fighting his infection, Marcus couldn't shake the doctor's odd reaction. So he did what anyone in the modern age would do. He Googled blood type inheritance, searching for information about how parents' blood types determine their children's possible blood types. What he found on multiple reputable medical websites made his heart stop, and his hands start trembling uncontrollably as the implications became horrifyingly clear. To parents with O-positive blood type can only produce children with O-positive or O-negative blood types due to the way blood type genetics work, with O being recessive and the positive, negative factor being determined by specific genetic inheritance patterns. It is genetically impossible for 2 O-positive parents to have a child with O blood type, which requires inheriting an A allele from one parent and a B allele from the other parent, genes that neither Marcus nor Rachel possessed according to their stated blood types. Marcus read article after article, medical journal after medical journal, hoping to find some exception, some rare genetic mutation or medical anomaly that could explain how his son could have O negative blood when both parents were O positive. But every single source confirmed the same devastating truth. If Ethan's blood type was truly O negative, then Marcus could not possibly be his biological father. because the genetics simply did not allow for that possibility under any circumstances. Marcus sat at his computer until 3 in the morning, reading and rereading the same information, hoping he was misunderstanding something, hoping there was some explanation he was missing. But the science was clear and irrefutable, and the implications were absolutely devastating to his sense of reality and everything he thought he knew about his life, his marriage, and his son. The next morning, Marcus called the urgent care facility and spoke with the doctor, asking if there could have been any mistake with the blood typing, any possibility of a lab error or sample mix-up that might explain the discrepancy between Ethan's blood type and what should be genetically possible, given his parents' blood types. The doctor, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation and understanding exactly what Marcus was really asking, explained that blood typing is one of the most basic and reliable tests in medicine, that multiple checks are performed to ensure accuracy, and that there was virtually no possibility of error, especially since the odd negative result had been confirmed twice through different testing methods. As part of their standard protocols for rare blood types, the doctor also gently suggested, with professional compassion in his voice, that if Marcus had concerns about paternity, there were discrete testing services available that could provide definitive answers, and that many men in similar situations found that certainty, however painful, was better than lingering doubt and suspicion that could poison a relationship. Marcus thanked the doctor, hung up the phone, and sat in his car in the urgent care parking lot, crying for the first time since his father's funeral 5 years ago, his entire body shaking as the reality of his situation crashed over him like a tidal wave. The son he loved and raised for 6 years, the child he'd sacrificed for, worked extra hours for, saved money for, read bedtime stories to, taught to ride a bike, comforted through nightmares, celebrated birthdays with, and loved with every fiber of his being, might not be his biological child at all. Marcus ordered a paternity test kit online that same day, paying extra for expedited shipping and processing because he couldn't bear the uncertainty for longer than absolutely necessary, couldn't continue playing father and husband without knowing the truth, couldn't look at Rachel or Ethan without the question spinning in his mind like a tornado, destroying everything in its path. The kit arrived days later in discreet packaging, and Marcus waited until Rachel took Ethan to his weekly soccer practice on Saturday morning, before following the simple instructions to collect his DNA sample via cheek swab and preparing Ethan's sample using hair follicles he collected from his son's hairbrush, which the kit confirmed would provide sufficient DNA for accurate testing purposes. Marcus packaged everything according to instructions and drove to the FedEx office to overnight the samples to the testing laboratory, paying an additional $100 for the fastest possible processing because every day of not knowing felt like torture, like living in a surreal nightmare where nothing was certain and everything he believed about his life might be revealed as complete fiction. The testing company promised results within 3 business days for the expedited service, and Marcus spent those 72 hours barely sleeping, barely eating, going through the motions of normal life while internally falling apart, smiling at Ethan during breakfast and feeling his heart break at the possibility that this child might not be his, kissing Rachel goodbye before work and wondering if she was a cheating liar who deceived him for nearly 7 years, sitting at his desk staring at spreadsheets while obsessively checking his email for the test results that would either confirm his worst fears or prove them unfounded and allow him to breathe again. The email arrived on a Wednesday afternoon at 2:47 p.m. A message from the testing laboratory with the subject line DNA test results available and a link to their secure portal where Marcus could access his confidential report with complete privacy. Marcus's hands shook so badly he could barely click the link, could barely enter his password, could barely navigate to the results page. And when he finally saw the official report with its clinical language and scientific data, the words seemed to blur together except for one sentence printed in bold at the top of the summary section. The alleged father is excluded as the biological father of the tested child. Probability of paternity, 0%. Marcus read that sentence over and over, his vision tunneling, his breathing becoming shallow, the noise of his office fading away as the confirmation of his worst nightmare became official. An irrefutable Ethan was not his biological son. The child he'd loved and raised for 6 years shared no genetic connection with him whatsoever, and Rachel had either knowingly deceived him or had cheated without being certain of the child's paternity. either scenario representing a betrayal so profound that Marcus felt like his entire identity as a father and husband was being erased in real time. The detailed report showed that there were 0 genetic markers matching between Marcus and Ethan, no possibility of relation, no chance of laboratory error given the comprehensive nature of the testing performed, and included helpful information about next steps, counseling resources, and legal options for men in his situation, as if any of that could address the fundamental destruction of his reality and purpose in life. Marcus sat at his desk, staring at the computer screen, and realized that everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed for, everything he'd believed about his life for the past 6 years had been built on a lie, and the rage that began building in his chest was unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. In his generally calm and measured existence, Marcus didn't confront Rachel immediately because he needed time to think, to plan, to decide how to handle this revelation that would inevitably destroy his marriage and potentially his relationship with the child he'd raised as his son regardless of biology and emotional attachment. Instead, he began investigating, looking for evidence of Rachel's affair, trying to determine who Ethan's biological father might be, and whether Rachel had knowingly deceived him or had genuinely not known about the paternity question herself. Though either way, the betrayal was devastating and unforgivable in Marcus's mind. Marcus started going through old photos, social media posts, emails he could access, and any other digital footprints, looking for clues about Rachel's activities around the time Ethan would have been conceived in late 2016, approximately 7 years ago, when they'd been married for about a year and living in their first apartment before buying their current house. What Marcus discovered in his investigation made the betrayal even worse and transformed his grief into cold, calculated anger that demanded not just answers but consequences that would make Rachel face the full weight of what she'd done to him and their life together and his identity as a father. He found Facebook messages from 2016 that Rachel had apparently forgotten existed. In her archived messages, conversations with a man named Derek Phillips who'd been Rachel's high school boyfriend, messages that showed they'd reconnected at their 10-year high school reunion in September 2016, exactly the time frame when Ethan would have been conceived according to his birthday in June 2017. The messages between Rachel and Derek were explicitly romantic and sexual, with Derek writing things like, "I've never stopped thinking about you," and "that night was incredible, just like old times," while Rachel responded with messages about how being with Derek again had made her feel alive and passionate in ways she hadn't felt in her marriage, how she'd been feeling disconnected from Marcus even though they'd only been married a year, how the reunion had rekindled feelings she thought were gone forever and made her question her life choices and whether she'd married the right person. The timeline became devastatingly clear as Marcus pieced together the evidence, with the methodical attention to detail that made him successful in his accounting career. Rachel had attended her high school reunion in September 2016, claiming she was going alone because Marcus had to work that weekend on a major project deadline. Rachel had spent the entire weekend at the reunion and related events, staying at a hotel in her hometown 3 hours away, and based on the messages Marcus found, had spent at least one night, possibly the entire weekend, sleeping with Derek, rekindling their old relationship in what she'd apparently convinced herself was just a nostalgic fling that wouldn't affect her real life and marriage to Marcus. The messages showed that Derek had wanted to continue the affair, had suggested they meet up again and maintain some kind of relationship, but Rachel had told him it was a one-time thing, a mistake born of nostalgia and too much wine at the reunion, that she loved her husband and wanted to make her marriage work, effectively ending things with Derek while apparently having no idea she might be pregnant. From their weekend together, Marcus found messages from November 2016, about 6 weeks after the reunion, where Rachel excitedly told Marcus they were pregnant, a surprise pregnancy she'd attributed to a lucky romantic weekend they'd spent together in late September celebrating their first anniversary, convincing both of them that Ethan had been conceived during that celebration, when Rachel had actually been pregnant from her affair with Derek just days or weeks earlier. The level of deception was staggering. Rachel had cheated at her reunion, returned home, and made love to her husband to cover her tracks or simply as part of their normal marriage, and when she discovered she was pregnant had simply assumed, or perhaps hoped, that Marcus was the father, never revealing her affair, never suggesting a paternity test, never showing any guilt or concern as Marcus bonded with Ethan from the moment of his birth, and throughout the past 6 years, Marcus spent the weeks gathering every piece of evidence he could find, screenshots of all the messages between Rachel and Derek, photos from the reunion weekend that showed them together in ways that suggested more than friendship, credit card statements showing Rachel's hotel room charges and restaurant bills during that week, and that Marcus had never questioned because he trusted his wife completely, and most importantly, the paternity test results that proved Ethan was not his biological son with scientific certainty. That couldn't be disputed or explained away. Marcus also hired a private investigator to locate Derek Phillips and confirm his current situation, discovering that Derek was married with 2 children of his own, living in Texas, working as a sales manager, and apparently having no idea that his high school reunion fling with Rachel had resulted in a child, since Rachel had never told him about Ethan's existence. Perhaps because she genuinely believed Marcus was the father, or perhaps because she'd wanted to avoid the complication of Derek being involved in her life and potentially destroying both their marriages and her comfortable existence. The investigator provided Marcus with Derek's contact information, employment details, and home address, information that Marcus filed away as potential ammunition for the plan forming in his mind, a plan that would ensure Rachel faced consequences, not just in their private divorce, but in ways that would impact her reputation, her family relationships, and her future in the same way she'd impacted his entire life and identity as a father to a child who wasn't biologically his. Marcus consulted with a family law attorney named Patricia Chen, who specialized in cases involving paternity fraud, a specific area of family law that dealt with situations where men had been deceived about fathering children, and Patricia explained Marcus's legal position in terms that were both informative and infuriating to hear. In their state, the law regarding paternity was complex and often favored maintaining established parent-child relationships over biological truth, meaning that because Marcus had acted as Ethan's father for 6 years, providing financial support, emotional care, and establishing a legal parental relationship by being married to Rachel when Ethan was born, the court might still consider him the legal father regardless of biology and might order him to continue paying child support, even though Ethan wasn't his biological child, a situation that seemed monstrously unjust but reflected the legal system's priority on children's welfare over fathers' rights in paternity disputes. However, Patricia also explained that the paternity fraud would significantly impact other aspects of the divorce, including potential criminal charges for fraud if Rachel had knowingly deceived him, civil lawsuits for damages related to the money he'd spent supporting a child under false pretenses, and certainly a complete elimination of any possibility of alimony since Rachel's infidelity and deception had directly caused the marriage breakdown. Patricia advised Marcus to document everything meticulously, to avoid confronting Rachel until all evidence was secured and legal strategies were prepared, and to prepare himself emotionally for a long and difficult battle that would involve not just his marriage ending, but potentially losing the child he'd raised and loved as his son, since Derek as the biological father might have parental rights that could supersede Marcus's established relationship if Derek chose to pursue them. Once he learned of Ethan's existence, the advice about potentially losing Ethan was what finally broke through Marcus's rage and forced him to confront the most painful aspect of this entire situation, regardless of biology, regardless of Rachel's betrayal, regardless of the lies and deception that had characterized the past 6 years. Ethan was still the little boy Marcus had raised from birth, had taught to walk and talk, had comforted through countless nights of childhood illnesses and bad dreams, had celebrated every milestone with and loved with every fiber of his being in every moment of his daily life. The paternity test results didn't change 6 years of memories, didn't erase the bond they'd formed through daily interaction and care, didn't make Marcus feel any less like Ethan's father in every way that mattered beyond genetics and biological connection. And the thought of losing that relationship because of Rachel's actions was devastating in ways that even the betrayal itself couldn't match in terms of emotional pain. Marcus realized he wanted revenge against Rachel for her lies and deception, wanted her to face consequences for what she'd done to him and the life he built on false premises, wanted the world to know the truth about her infidelity and fraud, but he didn't want to lose Ethan in the process, Didn't want his son because Ethan was still his son in every meaningful way despite DNA to suffer because of his mother's mistakes. Marcus finally confronted Rachel on a Saturday evening after putting Ethan to bed, having prepared himself emotionally and legally for this conversation that would end their marriage and change all their lives forever in ways that couldn't be undone or walked back. He sat her down in their living room, pulled out printed copies of the paternity test results along with screenshots of her messages with Derek, and said simply, "Ethan isn't my son. I know about Derek. I know about the reunion. I know you've been lying to me for 6 years. I need you to explain everything, and I need the truth right now. Because this is your only chance to be honest before lawyers get involved. And this becomes a legal battle that will destroy whatever dignity you have left." Rachel's face went completely white as she stared at the paternity test results, her hands trembling visibly, her mouth opening and closing without words coming out, the shock and fear in her eyes confirming that she'd known, or at least suspected, the truth about Ethan's paternity, had carried this secret for years while watching Marcus bond with a child who wasn't biologically his, had accepted his financial support and emotional investment while knowing or suspecting that everything was built on a lie. When she finally found her voice after what felt like an eternity of silence, Rachel tried several different approaches in rapid succession, first denying everything and claiming the paternity test must be wrong despite Marcus showing her the detailed scientific report with its 0% probability of paternity, then claiming she hadn't known for certain that Ethan wasn't Marcus's because she'd slept with both Derek and Marcus around the same times, so there was no way to know without testing. Then finally, when Marcus showed her the messages between her and Derek and the timeline that made her previous claims obvious lies, given that she'd been with Derek weeks before being with Marcus, breaking down completely and admitting the truth, in a rush of tears and desperate explanations and attempts to make him understand her perspective, Rachel confessed that yes, she'd slept with Derek at the reunion, that it had been a terrible mistake born of too much alcohol and nostalgia for her youth, and feelings of being trapped in a new marriage that already felt routine and boring, that she'd immediately regretted. Aiden returned home determined to forget it ever happened and be a good wife to Marcus and make their marriage work. That when she discovered she was pregnant 6 weeks later, she genuinely hoped Marcus was the father and had convinced herself that the timing worked out with their anniversary celebration, even though deep down she'd had doubts given the dates, and that as the years passed and Ethan didn't really look like Marcus, and people kept commenting on the lack of resemblance, she'd suspected the truth, but had been too afraid to confirm it or tell Marcus because she knew it would destroy their family and her comfortable life. Rachel's tears and explanations did nothing to soften Marcus's rage. If anything, her admission that she'd suspected the truth for years made things exponentially worse, because it meant she'd had multiple opportunities to tell him, multiple chances, over 6 years to be honest, and let him make informed decisions about his life, but had instead chosen continued deception day after day, choosing her own comfort and security over his right to know the truth about the child he was raising and supporting financially and emotionally. Marcus listened to her desperate attempts to explain and justify her choices, and then he laid out exactly what was going to happen with cold precision that shocked Rachel, because she'd never seen this side of her generally mild-mannered husband. They were getting divorced immediately, with Marcus filing the papers within the week. Rachel would be moving out of the family home that Marcus would keep since he'd paid for it entirely with his income, while she'd contributed nothing financially during their marriage. She would receive no alimony whatsoever given her infidelity and fraud that had caused the marriage breakdown. She would need to find a job immediately to support herself, since Marcus would no longer be her financial provider under any circumstances. And most devastatingly for Rachel, Marcus was going to tell both their families and their entire friend group exactly why the marriage was ending, ensuring that everyone knew about her infidelity and 6-year deception that had defrauded him of time, money, and emotional investment in a child that wasn't biologically his. Rachel begged him not to tell their families, pleaded that they could keep the reasons for divorce private, claimed that public exposure would destroy her relationship with her parents and siblings, who were traditional and religious and would never forgive her for infidelity and deception of this magnitude. But Marcus was completely unmoved by her pleas, pointing out coldly that she hadn't cared about destroying his life and identity as a father when she'd lied to him for 6 years, and that she'd forfeited any right to privacy or protection when She'd chosen deception over honesty year after year after year, with full knowledge of what she was doing. Marcus also informed Rachel that he'd located Derek Phillips, knew exactly where he lived and worked, and that Derek had a wife and 2 children, who had no idea about his affair, and was planning to inform Derek that he had a 6-year-old biological son he'd never known about, ensuring that the biological father was aware of Ethan's existence even if it complicated everyone's lives, and destroyed Derek's marriage the same way Rachel's affair had destroyed their marriage. Rachel became absolutely hysterical at this revelation, begging Marcus not to contact Derek, claiming it would destroy Derek's marriage and family and hurt innocent people, that Derek's wife and children didn't deserve that pain and disruption to their lives. But Marcus responded with cold logic that he and Ethan didn't deserve the pain Rachel had caused either, but she'd made her choices without concern for the consequences to anyone but herself, so why should he protect Derek or Derek's family when no one had protected him from this devastating truth? The divorce proceedings that followed were brutal and public in exactly the way Rachel had feared, with Marcus ensuring that the truth about Ethan's paternity and Rachel's deception became known to everyone in their lives through strategic and calculated revelation that maximized her humiliation and social consequences. While positioning himself as the sympathetic victim of fraud, Marcus started by telling his own parents and siblings exactly what had happened, showing them the paternity test results and explaining the 6-year deception in detail. And his family's reaction was immediate and supportive, with his mother crying for both her son and the grandson, who wasn't actually her biological grandchild, but whom she still loved. His father expressing rage at Rachel's betrayal and offering to help Marcus with legal costs, and his siblings offering any support Marcus needed through the divorce process. Then Marcus informed Rachel's parents, requesting a formal meeting and bringing copies of the paternity test results and evidence of the affair. Watching as Rachel's mother went pale and her father's face turned red with shame and anger at his daughter's actions that had brought disgrace to their family, Rachel's parents were devastated not just by the infidelity, but by the sustained deception, the fraud perpetrated against their son-in-law, who they'd welcomed into their family, and the disgrace Rachel had brought upon their family name in their religious community, where such behavior was considered absolutely unforgivable, sin deserving of social exile and judgment. Marcus also informed their mutual friend group through a carefully worded message explaining that he and Rachel were divorcing because paternity testing had revealed that Ethan was not his biological son, that Rachel had been unfaithful during their marriage, and the affair had resulted in Ethan's conception, and that he'd been deceived for 6 years about his son's paternity, asking for privacy during this difficult time, but making absolutely sure everyone knew exactly whose fault the divorce was and why their family was being destroyed. The social consequences for Rachel were immediate and severe, with friends overwhelmingly taking Marcus's side and expressing shock and disgust at Rachel's actions. Several people reaching out to offer support to Marcus while distancing themselves from Rachel completely. Rachel found herself increasingly isolated as word spread through their social network, with invitations drying up, phone calls going unreturned, and the comfortable suburban mom life she built crumbling as everyone learned the truth about her infidelity and fraud. Her own siblings distanced themselves from her, embarrassed by the scandal and unwilling to defend her actions to their religious parents, leaving Rachel more alone than she'd ever been in her life, and facing consequences she'd never imagined. When she'd made the choice to sleep with Derek 7 years ago, the most calculated aspect of Marcus's revenge came when he contacted Derek Phillips to inform him of his son's existence and ensure that Derek would be dragged into the consequences of the affair he'd participated in 7 years ago without knowing it had resulted in a child. Marcus sent Derek a certified letter with copies of the paternity test results, photos of Ethan, and a detailed explanation of the situation, making it clear that Derek had a 6-year-old biological son he'd never known about, and that this information was being shared because Derek had a right to know and because Marcus was ensuring everyone involved faced appropriate consequences. Marcus also included Derek's information in the divorce filing, ensuring that as Ethan's biological father, Derek would be potentially liable for child support and could be pursued for back support. For the 6 years he'd unknowingly had a biological child. When Derek received the letter, he was shocked and devastated, and the revelation destroyed Derek's own marriage when his wife discovered he'd had an affair. that had produced a child, leading to Derek's divorce and personal crisis that mirrored Marcus's experience. The question of Marcus's relationship with Ethan became the most complicated aspect of the situation. And after weeks of emotional turmoil, Marcus made a decision that surprised many people, but felt rigged. To him, he chose to maintain his legal parental rights and relationship with Ethan, finally for primary custody, rather than walking away from the child he'd raised. Because despite the biological reality in Rachel's betrayal, Ethan was still his son in every way that mattered emotionally and developmentally. The final divorce settlement gave Marcus primary physical custody of Ethan, based on Rachel's demonstrated dishonesty and poor judgment, with Rachel receiving standard visitation and having to pay child support to Marcus since Ethan lived primarily with him. An ironic reversal since Ethan was biologically Rachel's son, but Marcus was providing the majority of care. Marcus also ensured that Derek was formally established as Ethan's biological father through court-ordered testing, making Derek legally responsible for back child support and creating a complicated three-parent situation where Marcus was Ethan's legal and custodial father, Rachel was Ethan's biological mother with limited visitation, and Derek was Ethan's biological father with child support obligations 2 years after the divorce. The contrast between Marcus's life and Rachel's life demonstrated the completeness of his calculated revenge. Marcus has successfully rebuilt his life as a single father with primary custody of Ethan, maintaining his career and income while creating a stable home environment, and had even begun dating again, with women viewing his decision to remain Ethan's father despite the deception as evidence of strong character. Ethan thrived under Marcus's care, doing well in school and showing secure attachment to the man he called dad regardless of biology. Rachel struggled continuously with part-time parent status, modest income from restarting her real estate career, social isolation due to her damaged reputation, non-existent dating life, and strained relationships with her family who maintained distant disappointment. She had to watch Marcus flourish as a parent while she lived with reduced access to her biological son, and every visitation exchange reminded her of what her choices had cost. Marcus's revenge wasn't just in exposing Rachel's betrayal, it was in taking everything she'd valued, including daily access to Ethan, her comfortable life, her social standing, and her family's respect, while he maintained his role as Ethan's father and proved that love and commitment mattered more than DNA, ultimately making himself the hero of their story, while Rachel remained permanently marked as the woman whose selfish choices had destroyed the families.